I'd like to tell you about my first year serving in elected office in Kentucky. I am the first in my family to serve in office. I obviously do not come from political family lineage, and I did not grow up with a well-known last name. And I'm hardly the candidate that is embraced by the political status quo, and I rarely run in political circles. And just to give you an idea of the political context in my state, most of the politicians in office in Louisville, my hometown, and Kentucky are white men. And despite that, I won my election in 2016 against a 34-year incumbent who was a white guy, and I won in a three-way race with 52% of the vote. And now, as the first black woman and the first woman of color, period, to serve in our state legislature in nearly 20 years, I know that people are depending on me to stand up for freedom, justice, and equity. And the people that I'm talking about are my loving community of family and friends who traveled from across Kentucky to see me get sworn in January 2017. And I'm talking about nearly 100 elementary school kids, other young people, black folks, white folks, people who are Latinx, LGBTQ people, folks from across Kentucky who showed up in solidarity with me wearing red because red is one of my favorite colors. And I will also add that there were people across the country, colleagues and friends who couldn't make it to Kentucky, and they wore red as well and posted on their social media that day, congratulations to me for serving in office. And it was beautiful to see our House gallery overflowing with people, and then the overflow room in the Kentucky Supreme Court chamber full of people, and then to see these beautiful kids sitting cross-legged on the floor of their state capitol. And it was wonderful to share that day with my kids and with my daughter, who in her 16 years had never seen someone who looks like her serving in our state legislature. And I know that it mattered to people across my district, which is 50% black, 50% white, 79% of voters are age 50 and older, and 62% of voters are women. It mattered to them to have someone who would speak out and stand up against political bullies and people who were using the Bible as a political weapon. And women wanted another representative who would speak up for our reproductive rights. And on that day of my swearing in, I felt resilient. And that feeling soon diminished when I walked into our House chambers, and seated in front of me was the person from Bullitt County who had campaigned using images of First Lady and President Obama as apes. And the offense is clear when you know that there are 100 members of our House, which means that either one of us could have been seated somewhere else on that House floor. But majority leadership decided to sit the only black woman in the House behind someone who is blatantly racist. And so it was clear to me going into a legislature that is 94% white that the odds were stacked against me. But I knew that I belonged there because people from across my district told me when I knocked on doors that they did not feel represented. And people in predominantly black West Louisville told me that they were tired of being ignored. And people in predominantly white East Louisville told me that they were tired of the attacks on people who are LGBTQIA+. And across the district, people talked about their concerns with environmental and infrastructure issues. So I knew that I had to be there. Sometimes I'm the only person in one of my committees who is there to speak up when harmful and hateful and hurtful legislation is introduced. In 2017, House Bill 151 was introduced, the Neighborhood Schools Bill, which was designed to resegregate our public schools by ending busing and creating neighborhood schools. That would mean that the 65,000 kids in the Jefferson County public school system where I live would be segregated by neighborhood, and that they would no longer be afforded the opportunity to attend school with people who are from different countries and in schools where 120 different languages are spoken by our students. And y'all, I was one of those students who was bused, and this is a picture of my high school graduation. I am a graduate of our public school system. My son graduated from the same high school as me, and my daughter will graduate from her public high school in 2019. So it was interesting to me to be in the committee meeting where this bill was discussed, House Bill 151, and to have a speaker who talked about inner city and urban kids being violent drug addicts. He actually said that if these kids were not in school, they would walk down the street shooting people. And not one person in committee challenged him in that moment. I guess to keep from humiliating him. And I have to say that I am proud of the people in my district, and so I spoke up in their defense. People like the folks in this image who rebuilt a community garden on a lot that had sat vacant for nearly 40 years. And so after the committee meeting, several of the members of the committee came up to me and said that they were bothered by his comments as well. Yet they did not say anything when it mattered the most. And I will tell you that when you are silent, you are complicit. They left the lone black woman there to speak out. And that night, I received an email from a guy who asked me, "Why are you always so angry when you speak?" It's like, really? I challenge a white guy in committee, and that translates to the angry black woman? So I actually went to some of my colleagues and asked, "Am I angry when I speak?" And one of the white women said, "You're not angry enough." Okay. And the offenses continued. So House Bill 520, which was the charter school bill, was introduced. And speaker after speaker who supported the bill talked about how beneficial it would be for black kids in Kentucky. So I asked the bill sponsor, had he talked to any of his black colleagues in the House? I mean, there are only 6 of us to talk to. And his answer was no. He didn't bother to talk to any of us to find out whether or not we had spoken to educators or parents to find out from them their concerns with charter schools, concerns that included schools taking away funding from our public schools that have only experienced cuts since 2008, or that kids of color will continue to experience an academic achievement gap, or that kids with disabilities are often excluded from admission into charter schools. It would have been easy for me to have given up this legislative session because it was quite disappointing. But when I would hear from people in the district, like some of the folks pictured here who would say to me, "We appreciate the fact that you speak up and you show up and you stand up for human rights and social justice despite the odds against you. And those odds began to change when I would have colleagues who would say to me, the fact that I speak up in committee and on the House floor for social justice inspired them to speak up. I had one of my colleagues, a woman, who asked me how was I going to vote on a gang violence reduction bill. And I told her how I was going to vote and why. And she said, I'm going to vote in solidarity with you because it's the right thing to do. So only 3 of us ended up voting against that bill, but it didn't end up going anywhere anyway. And then when the Blue Lives Matter bill came up for a debate on the House floor, and to hear my white colleagues say, our life experiences are different than that of people of color, and their perspectives matter. I know that I belong in this political space because now my kids and young people across Kentucky get to see a Black woman who is focused on civic engagement, who is working on public policy, and who is guided by a moral compass that believes in lifting up people who are left behind. And no longer are Black women invisible in our state legislature. And I know that it matters for me to be here in this political space for people who feel like they've been left out, discriminated against, told that they were too young to run, or it was not their time to run, or that they were not political team players because they refuse to succumb to the political status quo. I know that we all belong in politics. And so as an activist and organizer, I know that sometimes the challenges that we face can seem insurmountable. And I also know that means that I have to keep pushing onward with everlasting resistance. That, in other words, I have to keep using my power and my voice for people who have felt ignored. Because if I don't speak up, who will? And in the words of the former governor of the state of Washington, Christine Gregoire, if you don't run, who will? And so now I have women of color from across Kentucky who are saying to me that they want to run for office. And I look forward to supporting them and getting out the way so that they can serve in my stead or serving side by side with them while I am still in office. Because I should no longer be the only Black woman or the only woman of color serving in Kentucky's legislature. And in our country, not one state house should be without the life experiences, the stories, or the voices of women of color. And I know that I am serving people who now have someone who not only looks like them in office, but I've been told by many of the white folks that I serve that I'm speaking up for their issues as well. And that's what happens when you bring diversity and inclusion and are intentional about your representatives, whether local or state office. And that's why I'm here to tell you that if you have ever doubted that you belong in politics, look around. You belong there, and you are needed. I believe in a reflective democracy for all of us who are claiming our space and owning our power. Thank you.